The presentation then?
Yes.
Great. So I'll share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I will. So I'll be talking about mythological migrations, imagining queer Muslim utopias. That's my doctoral project. The focus is looking at those issues through artistic and curatorial strategies of collaboration, collective resistance, and collision building. Essentially, the contextual background responds to the 2015 Syrian migrant crisis, as many people will already be familiar. That was a time where a lot of Arab immigrants were arriving into Europe, and there was significant problematic rhetoric around not welcoming those bodies or providing them safety. And so there was certainly a rise of Islamophobia, racism, and anti-immigrant sentiments, but also there were instances of homophobia and transphobia that was particularly manifesting within the context of the queer immigrant Muslim body that was being perceived in many ways as this other, this terrorizing, unwanted figure that was coming apparently to destabilize and attack the ideas of European secular freedoms. And so for me, that becomes a point of entry. And I was based in Helsinki, Finland at the time. And so I started thinking about the kind of issues that were occurring there. So over there, we had instances where a lot of the Arab and African immigrants that were coming in, they were facing rejections at gay nightclubs in Helsinki. And over time, it was proven to be a racist pattern that was particularly targeting and isolating them. And this very much was, kind of in the context of the issues of the historical issues and contextualizations of race in Finland, where, in a nutshell, it felt it was not necessarily part of the same kind of conversations countries like France, Germany went through after the Second World War. And so, they developed in a way that they felt that, they were this advanced, socially, democratic context that did not have issues of racism in that society. However, until the 2015 Syrian migrant crisis, that issue had not been put to the test. And so this is the kind of context that my project started to emerge out of. And I started to think about ways in which we could kind of use artistic and curatorial strategies to address these kind of challenges that were manifesting within the context of the queer Muslim immigrant body in that setting. So one of the key concepts that I look at is the notion of feminist border thinking. This is an idea by Maria Cristina Luganis, who was an Argentinian American scholar, and she builds it upon Gloria Anzaldua's idea of borderlands, where essentially borderlands is proposed as this in-between space that kind of exists between the first world and the third world. Anzaldúa talks about it in relation to the US and Mexican border, but essentially proposes that it can also be a space of resistance, of reimagining and protest. And so that is the kind of idea that, Lugonis takes forward in her theorization to propose practical ways and formal ways in which we can come together and address the systemic issues that affect us, that divide us. And so she proposes this no this these strategies of collectivity, collision, collaboration, and through community as well as collision building. And this she argues is a way to dismantle the larger histories of colonial logic which dictate our realities. Alongside that, I bring in the notion of queer assemblages. This is an idea by Just Puar, where it moves away from the idea of intersectionality to challenge intersectionality and to advance it through the lens of assemblages, where what we see, the logic of the world system, so to speak, where we have colonialism, we have capitalism and patriarchy coming together and defining every aspect of our lives, where we see that intersectionality and ideas of intersectionality are also weaponized, as if, queerness, and they start becoming proposed as these separate ideas. So, for example, queerness is seen then as something that cannot be compatible with Muslim as an idea to the European imagination, coming from a space, a context that is yet to arrive in modernity from that perspective. And because queerness is understood in the secular Eurocentric Western logic as something that emerged beyond their enlightenment, then the two become um, oxymorons, if you like. They become contradictory ideas to the European Western mind. And so that is the kind of space that we need to kind of start challenging, where we need to think in complex ways, where, for instance, when we talk about whiteness and in race, we have to kind of understand that that does not necessarily mean that all white bodies are necessarily going to be, um, participating in oppressive policies. And it certainly does not mean that people of color cannot perform those kind of oppressions as well. We've seen this in recent history where someone like Rishi Sunak, who became the Prime Minister of the UK, was a brown Indian man, an immigrant, but certainly his policies did very little, if anything at all, to advance issues of marginalization, in particular for racialized bodies. And so that is the kind of logic we need to kind of start thinking toward, that, these identity categories that we're working with, they are constantly in flux. And this is something, where assemblages comes in, where we have to start thinking about layering them and working with them in complex ways. And so I bring that within my dissertation through two artistic events, two artistic components. So the first one was called Chapter 1, the Nightclub, and that took place as a live event in Helsinki. I chose the space of the nightclub because I felt that that was marked with a history of exclusion in the city, where these immigrant bodies were being rejected at the door. And so I wanted to use that as a space to challenge. The second one, Chapter 2, The Dark Room, took place, it was meant to take place physically in a gay bathhouse in Helsinki. However, because of COVID, I organized it online. In this presentation, I will specifically be focusing on Chapter 1, the nightclub, and because of Kalam and the context of this gathering, I wanted to speak a little bit about how I connect the kind of theorizations I've spoken about and explore them through an Islamic cultural perspective. And to do that, I started looking at how issues of gender and sexuality are being spoken about or written about in from an Islamic perspective. And two people that come to mind are, of course, Amna Wadud and Scott Kugel. Amna Wadud speaks about advancing issues of Islamic theology from a women's perspective. And in my opinion, I think that paves the way for someone like Google to talk about homosexuality and an inclusion of that within Islamic theological perspectives. However, with Google, we also see the dangers of looking at the Islamic discourse and the conversation of queerness within, or homosexuality and queerness at large within the Islamic context, exclusively within the theological perspective, where he states that, he's been able to find evidence in the Quran and Hadith that somehow homosexuality is permissible, trans individuals are permissible, but bisexuality is not permissible. And so, while I understand the logic of that kind of argument, I also think that there is a danger there where if we are constantly trying to work with texts and positioning them in their historical context only, and thinking about Islam fragmented from culture, from society, and community as it's evolved over hundreds of years, then there will always be an inherent danger for exclusions to exist. And that is why I think the kind of ideas proposed by Amna Wadud and other people like Asma Barlas as well, that point to the subjectivity of the translation in itself, and the subjectivity inherently present in interpretation as useful tools to think about expanding these conversations. And so I build upon that idea and I look at how that has happened in history. And there is evidence of how when the sacred word, when the Islamic word traveled to non-Arabic speaking contexts. So we see how when it arrived in, the Ottoman context, or when we see Islam arriving and existing within the Persian context or the Mughal context in South Asia, we see significant evidence of how this kind of process of translation led to not only interpretations theologically, but also cultural and artistic interpretations and innovation. And this is very much present in the context of Surah Rahman, which is a chapter in the Quran, and over there we see a very a visually articulate description of heaven. In particular, this idea of the Char Bagh comes up, where four gardens in heaven are described. And those gardens then uh, are interpreted in Ottoman, Persian, and Mughal periods at various points. So we see them in these kind of paintings, for example, that I've illustrated on this slide, but also in physical architecture. So Taj Mahal in India, or Naqsh Jahan Square, Lahore Fort, Shalimar Gardens. There are countless examples of architectural spaces that use the four garden grid system as evocative of this notion of paradise, referencing the Quran in itself and taking those ideas that were expressed as sacred text and then imagining them and innovating them within society. And so for me, I'm very much interested in that kind of idea, that kind of history of Islam, to think about expanding it. If we have this precedent existing, where there were periods in Islamic history and civilizations where people were innovating based on sacred text, based on translations and interpreting those sacred texts, then what is stopping us now from carrying on that tradition? The only rupture that exists or that has happened is obviously because of colonization, where somehow we think that Islam and ideas of Islam are like an artifact set in a specific time. So when we talk about Islamic art and architecture, often historians in the West would like to think about it set in particular time periods. However, if we think about ourselves, which we are living bodies and part of a living tradition and legacy, then we should be able to rebuild on those traditions and continue that dialogue uninterrupted. And so I think that, for me, that is the kind of idea that I've been proposing through my dissertation, and that is the framework that I kind of wanted to build up. And just to kind of backtrack a little bit and provide a little bit more context, the reason I wanted to do this specifically was so that when I'm talking about the queer Muslim body, it is not as if I am necessarily bringing in the idea of queerness as it's understood in the West and imposing it onto another body elsewhere, but really looking at it in a dialogical way where there are instances of Islamic history and pasts that allow us to challenge queerness as it's understood in the West in itself. And so that is why it was very integral for me to kind of have this component within the framework of my PhD, my doctoral dissertation. And so alongside the charbagh, I became interested in another instance of the burak. This was a creature that took that as legend dictates, that took Prophet Muhammad on a night journey, a two-part night journey from Medina to Mecca, from Medina to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem to heaven. Um, and then I might be mixing up. It might be Mecca, but it took the Prophet to Jerusalem and then to heaven. And so what is interesting is that of course is a night as known as the Miraj, that is has a very significant place in Islamic theology as well, because that is where the fundamental pillars of Islam were revealed to the Prophet, and a lot of the regulations that exist in Islam were kind of brought forward to the Prophet. But over time, what is interesting is that the creature in itself is something that has inspired a lot of Muslim artists, and has inspired a lot of interpretation. So we see three instances over here that are from different periods. So one is a Judo-Persian manuscript on the left, but in the middle we see another Persian interpretation, and finally we see something that is from recent history. That is how you see the Burak emerging and presented on trucks as a protection amulet, if you like, in India and Pakistan. And so it is something, again, that is an unbroken interpretation of the figure that has been carrying on for centuries. And so I think, for me, I was very interested in how we can kind of build upon these kind of traditions. And something that, is important to notice how the interpretation of the figure changes over time. How, in the early tradition, the face, which is often described in Hadith as this handsome-faced creature, that the interpretation of handsome, of course, as beauty is something we see changing and evolving with time in the different interpretations. And so in the beginning, it has this almost like a boy-like face in the left image, but towards the right, in recent interpretations, especially in India, it starts to become a woman's face. And so I think that is quite an interesting kind of way to think about it. It's, of course, also been used in a lot of artistic traditions. And so Anwar Said, who's a Pakistani artist, looks at same-sex desire. He also uses the Burak as a visual motive in his work, and you can see it on the top right. And so these are the kind of traditions I wanted to build upon and think about how the Burak, as Yasmin Seal states, was not born a woman, she became one. But when it happened is unclear, because early interpretations, visual interpretations of the Burak do indeed depict it more boy-like in terms of its face. And then it starts to become this female embodiment of the creature. And so, if you think about the figure in how it's evolved historically, it can be seen. This is what I write in my dissertation. It could be seen as a shape-shifting character that resists being confined to a definitive representation, continuously altering form and remaining enigmatic, something that is mysterious, if you like. And so she is a fluid entity that traverses border spaces between the terrestrial and celestial realms across multiple times and spaces. And in this sense, we can argue that she, he, they, whatever we want to refer to it, has always embodied queerness before even the word for queer and its modern Western constructs existed. And so I think, for me, it becomes a way in to then start thinking about these kind of motives and expanding upon them visually and artistically. And so I do this, with my film Journey to the Charbagh, where the Burak appears in three iterations. What I'll do is I'll quickly show a trailer for the film. Let me know if you are unable to hear the sound.
ਜਾਇ ਪੁੱਛੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਣੀਆਂ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਅੰਦਰ ਬਲਦੀਆਂ ਡਾਂਡੀਆਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਅਰਜ਼ ਨਾ ਕੀਤੀ ਦਰਦਿਆਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਬੋਲੀ ਚੰਗੀ ਬੋਲਦਾ ਪਰ ਕੁਝ ਲਫ਼ਜ਼ਾਂ ਤੇ ਅਟਕਦਾ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਉਹ ਕਿਸੇ ਪਾਰ ਪਰਦੇਸ ਦਾ ਵਾਂਢੀ
So in the film, this was just a trailer of the film. In the full film, which is about 17 minutes long, we see this reimagining of the figure of the Burak, and the Burak is moving through different kind of times and spaces. And as it moves, there are other symbolic elements that are coming in, such as the sun and the moon being in dialogue with each other. But in the film's context, the promised virgin enters as well, a hood. And so she disrupts the axis of the moon and the sun, and then escapes heaven. And so that was the kind of way I was thinking about it. And so that becomes the kind of opening act of the live event that I curated and put together at the nightclub in Helsinki. And the film was screened with projections of two bodies of water, which is again referenced in Surah Rahman, and then that becomes a stage for other performers, and artists to come in and join and activate. For me, it was integral that we are thinking about this conversation as not singular, but as a collective one where there are multiple queer Muslim migratory perspectives coming forward in the space, where it is clear that we may not all agree, and that is vital to having this discourse, that it is a complex and pluralistic conversation to be had. And so in that sense, it was meant to be kind of like a protest, but also a celebration that allowed for not only us as artists and creative practitioners to assemble, but also for audiences to be immersed in that context. And so you can see the audience kind of sitting there, and as the 2 hour event progressed, it moves from the film to a live performance by Mira and the band, um, which is a woman-led band in Helsinki, and it was formed of immigrants who had recently arrived in the country, and so they sang traditional music, which was again unusual for the particular nightclub context, which was known for its techno and contemporary European music. And so here we had live music where Mira and the band sang songs, popular songs from the Southwest Asian and North African region. And like songs that are associated with Feiruz or Warda Al Jazeera. And so there was a range of kind of music being played. And I think this is where it also became, there were many things that happened, like, in terms of how any challenges in the setup as well, where you see the musician in the middle playing an oud. And when the setup was happening, the musician appeared to be frustrated. So I went to inquire what the issue was. And the frustration was that the depth of the oud exceeded the sound limits of the nightclub sound systems. They were not made in a way to kind of amplify the sound. And so again, this was a serendipitous moment, if you like, where it revealed the challenges of working together and to kind of bringing these two different kind of cultural contexts together. And so thinking about the notion of the feminist border, thinking again, from that logic, it's not that we're trying to create a hybrid form here, but to kind of recognize these differences and to exist alongside and to hold space for those multiplicities. And so for me, that was quite revealing. Hello?
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry. I thought there was because I thought you said something. And so then, and then what was interesting was that even within the live event itself, it kind of allowed for the audience to come in, and so it wasn't a case where these presentations were taking place and just speaking at the audience, but they felt very much part of it, where a lot of the Iraqi community that was present in the room, many of the immigrants that came in to Finland were from the Iraqi community. And so they started requesting songs from Iraq. And so it was like a very powerful moment because, people were, of course, singing and dancing, but they were also, crying and holding each other because I suppose it was revealing how powerful an instrument music is in itself to evoke memory of times past, but also homelands. And so I think that was quite, powerful. That obviously went beyond my expectations, where I had put it together as something that, I felt was important to include, but I could not anticipate these kind of reactions at all. And so from there, the music we evolved to a video artwork by Tam. And in that, it's titled "Where Are You From?" Tam, who's a London-based Saudi Palestinian artist, looks at issues of identity, but thinks about how those ideas of identity become almost fetishized for the Western gaze, clickbaits, if you like, for the media to highlight queer Muslim woman from Saudi Arabia, from Palestine, to kind of then capitalize on. And so the video, it is a very short video, but a very powerful and confrontational piece that confronts the viewer quite directly and aggressively to question those kind of ideas internally and externally as well. There is a reversal of the role. She uses a lot of BDSM language, leather, and this kind of harnesses to kind of evoke that kind of push and pull between kind of sexual play and domination. And so from there we move to the final piece, Alif is for Awakening, where we have Faluda Islam appear, who is a zombie Muslim drag queen. She is dead and comes back from the future to destroy and wage a war against the US empire that has killed countless Muslim lives. And so Faluda appears. She honors the legacy and memory of Sana Mahatli, who's widely considered the first suicide bomber in the history of the world, who was a Lebanese woman, worked in a VHS store, and she went and blew herself up against an Israeli tanker that had breached southern Lebanon. And so that kind of militant and radical spirit becomes a place to kind of think about what if, every body that has been violated by the Western and by extension, by the US and by extension, the Eurocentric Western consortium, what if all of those bodies actually came back from the dead and started seeking revenge? And so it kind of moves from the here and now across, time, and, kind of bringing in the celestial and the terrestrial together. And so it is of course a very provocative piece, but that one that certainly challenges our thinking, and kind of creating an assemblage of these different kind of ways that we are fragmented and forced to think in divisions. And so with that, when the event ended, I think that I started thinking about how for me it was really a beginning. It kind of started revealing that, there were many interesting things that were happening in the collectivity, but there were also limits there for sure. I think that it was a live event. It was set, within a particular context, within a specific period of 2 hours. And so, it also created this kind of, as much as I wanted the plurality and multiplicity to exist, it still kind of brought it all together as a singular piece. And so for me, moving forward while I'm not discussing that in this presentation, for me, it kind of became it highlighted the essential need to also have dialogue as part of that conversation, to have conversations, and very much like we're having now, where we are kind of talking and hopefully kind of building upon those kind of conversations. So for me, it kind of does not exist as something that I see as fixed. I don't see it as something that is preaching what the queer Muslim immigrant body and ideas should look like. Rather, I think of it as an opening where we can have these conversations and continue to evolve together. And so, with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion that follows.
Thank you so much.
You could see the screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
We've seen everything, the videos and
Okay, so because right now, for some reason, the screen is not shared.
I know we see you and we see our screens up there.
Okay, great, great.
How are you personally? How is it in your country now?
I'm good. I'm in Montreal now, and it's really nice here. It's really sunny right now, but it's the end of the summer. I mean, it's been a busy year. Obviously, wrapping up my dissertation. I submitted it in June. I'm waiting for the examination results, which should come soon. And so, yeah, so hopefully the defense will be planned for the end of the year. So it's been a busy year, but otherwise life is good. Looking forward to future directions and plannings.
So nice. So what about the political context in Canada in regards to migration, the strategy, the agenda it looks like it's changing and so on.
It is changing, but I think that for some reason, I think it is interesting because I think so much of the world responds in reaction to other things. I think that certainly there are conservative directions in Canada, but I think with Trump and the kind of US narrative next door, I think there is also a resurgence of Canadian nationalism in a strange way that kind of wants to set itself apart from that kind of divisive rhetoric emerging from the US, where, Canada wants to then, or well, the Canadian people in general at least, want to appear and see themselves as more open and inclusive and welcoming. And so that is what, that propelled the current government to kind of successfully form a government because it was a Labour government, a Liberal government, and the Liberal government essentially was not expecting to win at all. They had the lowest ratings, and a conservative leader, not very different from Trump, was likely going to win. But when Trump happened and the kind of issues with Trump started happening, Canadian nationalism rose, and they brought in the the Liberal Party. And certainly this is not the most liberal kind of government. So, certainly the kind of policies are very conservative. Um, But we're seeing what's happening. I think it feels better to me in comparison to what we see in the US and the UK for sure. I don't know what's happening elsewhere in Europe, like what is the kind of direction, but certainly there's a pushback, but it does not feel as extreme as we're seeing in the UK and the US. Um, so yeah, there is hope. There is still hope. Um, and it's a very complex system because there is the federal government and then each province has its own government. So even if the whole like Canadian government, for example, might be liberal, but in Quebec, the provincial government is conservative. And so the policies also vary province to province. So, for example, in Quebec, the current government is doing a lot of damage in terms of, protecting healthcare, a lot of damage in terms of protecting cultural life and also on immigration. And so, it is a very complex space in that sense. But by and large, it feels better for me than the UK. I feel safer here, more stable here. But yeah, it's a different immigration category to being, a refugee or an asylum seeker. Like I imagine their kind of experience would be more precarious.
Any question? Question? Any question?
Yes, attendez un instant. En fait, yeah, Abdullah, c'est en français ou en anglais? C'était en anglais. Thank you very much for your speech. It was very interesting as well as to get a bit some Southeast Indian inputs. I couldn't really follow everything word by word. We'll have to see that again. We had a great impact here with queer Muslims, integration, Europe, and all that. I am of German Haitian descendants, and as you just said, I'm quite astonished. You speak about Canadian nationalism. I got this right. This is rising as well. Okay, Canada is at least one of the most European countries in northern Europe. I would like to say, as they speak at least 2 languages. I'm astonished about that. As I always had learned, j'ai appris, I learned that this is really the melting pot, that all people in a way, after 2 or 3 years, everybody is becoming Canadian. How come? What is your explanation for this? Come, all over the world, things are getting, in a word, economically a bit worse. How do you explain this for Canada? So this really is astonishing me. This really is shocking me because I think the outcome is for people who are a bit, how can I say, a bit more pigmented without speaking of the First Nations. How do you explain that? If not,
Yeah, it's a very problematic system, right? It's a very problematic system. So many of us, in many ways, Canada is not even in many ways, Canada is a settler colonial project. You know, it relies on immigration and skilled immigration in particular in recent years as a way to maintain and perpetuate its settler colonialism. Of course, the original First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada are the original custodians of the land. And as such, it's not called Canada, it's called Turtle Island, North America, and they have their own history of the different nations. And Canada, of course, came in as this colonial entity and has established itself and violated a lot of the treaty terms over the years. Um, and so certainly that exists, it's a very problematic structure. Many of us, before coming to Canada, do not know of that history. I mean, that is now becoming much, much more widely discussed. But, like I, for example, applied for immigration in 2015, or 2014 or 2015, I had no idea, about the Indigenous peoples of Canada. I had no knowledge, for me, coming from Pakistan, I was looking for a safe place that was open for LGBT people and would allow me future mobility in terms of having a Canadian passport, future professional opportunities. For me, like those were the kind of things that I was responding to from a very post-colonial lens. And it was only after arriving to Canada that I realized how complicit I have become then in kind of perpetuating the violence against Indigenous peoples of the land. And so, I am from an academic, artistic, critical context, so I'm aware of it. There's still so many people, who I personally know nothing about the Indigenous people and how Canada as a state is perpetuating and committing violence against, the original custodians constantly. It's still happening now. So it's not something that is just about residential schools. The last residential school I think ended in the 1990s, which is not so long ago. There was significant violence in that as well. But even now, there's a lot of Indigenous people that are disappeared, Indigenous activists that are disappeared, simply for asking the Canadian government to respect the sanctity of their land. And so it's an ongoing struggle, and I think that it is very much part of Canada's settler colonial project. It is part of its mechanics to ensure that there's a constant flow of people that are coming in that align with their kind of colonial settler values, capitalist values. Canada is a country that, is essentially a capitalist country that masquerades as a socialist country. On the surface, in comparison to the US, it appears very much as as a socialist project, but it is not. It is very much capitalist. And so that is why, there has been a rise in immigration because they wanted to kind of bring in these very specific immigrants, privileged immigrants, who are coming with a certain background of education, who are coming with a certain background of, wealth, or at least having savings, so that is something to be mindful of right now because of the economy and the inflation. They've put a pause on it because, of course, they've brought in so many immigrants that the systems are not prepared to handle that. And also, they've not invested in the systems adequately to ensure and retain that immigration, So it is, yeah, it's a very problematic system. And so I don't know if that answers your question. I was missing a few words, but I got the kind of gist that this is maybe what you were wanting or pointing toward. But if if I didn't get something, you can ask me that question again. Maybe you'll have to come closer to the mic because it was hard for me to hear.